Okay, Stu, the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome, Art. Um, Art Gotlieb is a local historian on the subjects of political and military history. He was formerly a professor, curator of the National History and Technology Director exhibits at the Intrepid Sea Air Space Museum in New York City. In these roles, Art worked regularly with veterans of all services towards the creation of exhibits accurately illustrating the history of 20th century warfare. From 1989 through 1997, Art coordinated with all the branches of the armed services and National Guard towards the preservation of historic ships, aircrafts, armor from around the world, and has facilitated the recovery of scores of artifacts from warships slated for demolition from from the reserve fleet. The past 16 years, artists refocused his professional efforts towards reaching out and addressing the growing needs of aging veterans and their families. Art, main, maintaining a private practice as a counselor and certified senior advisor in Norwalk, and offers pro bono counseling services to soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. He served as an auxiliary officer of the United States Coast Guard for 17 years, and for 4 years was commander of flotilla 7-2, 1st District, sector of Long Island Sound North. Today, obviously, he said going to talk about Charles Lindbergh, and it should be really interesting discussion, and we'll have questions afterwards. Art, welcome to the Senior Men's Association. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone. This Zoom format's actually been working out pretty well, do you think? I mean, I know that everyone wants to, be together, but I mean, considering, can you imagine if we didn't have Zoom through all of this pandemic stuff? So
Beard looks pretty good, Art.
yeah, I'm going to screen share now to pick up my PowerPoint, okay?
Yep.
Okay.
There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Good.
Yep.
All right. So, of course, Charles Lindbergh lived a long, full life. So there's a certain amount of time that I have to do this today. So I'm going to be focusing on certain aspects of it and less on other aspects of it. I think that the parts that are most interesting, for me at least, and I hope for you too, are his experiences with the rise of aviation and his controversial positions in the America First Party, right, or organization. America First Committee is what it was. And that really left a very long legacy for him, not necessarily a good one. But it's fascinating. He's a man of his time. Charles Lindbergh, 1902, born in Detroit. Anybody know where he died? Hawaii. And 1974. So
Hawaii.
Yeah, Hawaii. And so Charles Lindbergh was a person who went from obscurity, as you know, to somebody who was like the first major rock star. The newspapers were thinking that he was the biggest story since the rise of Christ from the grave. I mean, it was a pretty big deal, Charles Lindbergh. And the press really fawned over him later on, to a very detrimental effect, of course. And there he is. It's a nice young photograph of him. When we study things like celebrity and sociology, the question is always asked, would somebody be quite as popular, or would people be fawning over them if they weren't very good looking and this sort of a thing? Charles Lindbergh was tall, He was handsome. He had to kind of make his way up a little bit. And here's an aircraft that Charles Lindbergh had, 1925. Not quite a pilot. He couldn't really fly solo because he couldn't afford the bond in case he cracked up and wrecked the airplane. So he flew to make money, and he finally soloed and was able to purchase his own aircraft. And as you can see, this great photograph, Daredevil Lindbergh. You know, in 1925, there were a lot of barnstormers around. This was immediately after World War I, and there was surplus aircraft, and there were people who had flown in the Lafayette Extradrill, and they were, you know, I mean, aircraft hadn't really emerged as a viable form of transportation yet. And people were still asking themselves, well, what can we really do with these things besides, you know, fly through open doors on barns and things? And Lindbergh himself was somebody who is a wing walker. Pretty ballsy stuff, a little crazy, I think. And, but you had to make money. 1925. So one of the ways that Lindbergh actually advanced his own aviation career, and I don't mean to make that sound too cynical or nefarious or something. I mean, he actually got military training, and he went through the Army Air Corps flying program, and he emerged as a second lieutenant, which is what he's pictured here as. Except in 1925, you can see this photograph is dated, they didn't have any need for it. All right, he was he was in the reserves now. And so he was essentially acting as a civilian in most of the things he did after this, although he was still part of the Army Air Corps Reserve. He got a lot of valuable training, flying experience from this program. So he starts flying the mail, right? And this is his oath of allegiance to make sure that the mail is delivered on time, right? That I will faithfully perform all the duties required of me and obtain everything, you know, and all the rest of this. Flying the mail was a pretty big deal back in these days. He was flying from St. Louis to Chicago, and he actually had to ditch his aircraft twice. And he always made sure that he came back after he bailed out. He came back and made sure that the mail was retrieved from the wrecked aircraft, and then was actually delivered. Case in point, right? So here's a picture of the boys, and Lindbergh, he had to bail out on his way to Chicago, and I don't know what he did. I guess he got an Uber and he went back out there. And here was the aircraft, and it's a good photo op, I guess. And they took all of the aircraft didn't burn, so they were able to retrieve all the sacks of mail. And the most important thing, it didn't matter if you cracked up your plane, it made sure that you had to make sure that the mail got where it was going, which I kind of respect. And here, of course, this is like my favorite photograph. I love this. I mean, Lindbergh was tall. He was tall, he was lanky. He had that whole Norwegian looking thing going on. And this was about the equivalent of being Chuck Yeager as a test pilot, right? I mean, or Neil Armstrong in the first moon landing back in these days. It can't be underestimated how exciting and how daring it was to be a pilot in 1925, 1927. I saw a movie on, I guess it was Turner Classic Movies or something like that, with Clark Gable called Test Pilot, right? Maybe you guys have seen it. And it was I think it was from 1938, but it was like embodied this whole masculinity, kind of like, well, we're not sure if the wings are going to fall off, sir. Well, start it up anyway, and let's give it a go. That sort of a thing. Now, Charles Lindbergh wasn't quite that crazy, but at the same time, you would have to say that this guy had a heck of a lot of nerve, and he loved flying. There are people who actually love flying, and he was one of them. He was a natural in the cockpit. He was always very mechanically oriented when he was younger, taking things apart. So he was a natural, and this thing might as well have been a spacecraft for all the people on Earth were concerned. The Spirit of St. Louis, as you know, was built to compete in a trophy race across the Atlantic Ocean, right? Whoever can get from North America to Europe. I forgot the name of the trophy. I got it written down here someplace. But so it turns out, by the fact that other people dropped out or they were unsuccessful, he actually won. He actually won. And the Spirit of St. Louis, the aircraft, he was named as such because his backers were from St. Louis, people who fronted the money for the aircraft. And you know that the aircraft was built by Ryan Aircraft out in California, specifically built. And Charles Lindbergh was right there for the entire design of the aircraft. Ryan was able to use a standard airframe that they had, and they just converted it to Lindbergh specifications. In other words, I don't need to see forward, and I need as much gasoline as possible, obviously, right? So the whole aircraft was designed as a kind of like a big floating gas tank. The designers at Ryan felt like, well, aren't you going to have a second passenger? And Lindbergh didn't want to have a second passenger. He wanted to take whatever weight was going to be associated with a second pilot or a navigator, as it were. And he wanted that put into the gasoline. And he just decided he was going to stay awake, which is what he did. Here's kind of a fuzzy photograph or drawing. And I just wanted to show you, even though it's, I'm disappointed that this isn't as sharp as I wanted to be, but you can see clearly the silhouette of the aircraft here. And Lindbergh, normally the pilot would be further forward, but Lindbergh had already discovered from flying aircraft that carried the mail that if the pilot was sandwiched between a gas tank and the engine, that pretty much spelled doom in case there was a fire. So what Lindbergh wanted was he wanted to be behind, he didn't want to be sandwiched between the engine and the gas. And of course, we're talking about high octane aviation fuel. And there's two major gas tanks here. And you can see that for a standpoint of center of gravity. You can see how the mass of the gasoline is located right underneath the maximum lift of the wings, you see? And there is Lindbergh behind here. And he actually used a little periscope that you could see out, right? But most pilots, and remember, these were all tail draggers, so that means that the attitude of the aircraft was pointed up. And, so when you were taxiing around with these airplanes that had their nose up in the air, you couldn't really see forward anyway, you see? And the rest of the time, he was just going to be flying over the ocean. And if you needed to see something, you would bank the aircraft and look out. Great picture, isn't it? I love this shot. I've got a photograph later on for you that I just had to stick in here about Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart, if you know her, and I've got a good presentation on that. I just did it for another place about a few weeks ago. And it made me think of, I should stick it in here because the whole look of Amelia Earhart was based on Charles Lindbergh. And if you look at Amelia Earhart and the way she wore, men's clothes and slacks, and she, of course, was very thin and lanky also, not as tall as Lindbergh, but she was able to pick up on the kind of Lindbergh thing, Great photograph. Have you all seen the Spirit of St. Louis? You all been down to the Smithsonian, I guess, at one point or another? Yeah. And that's like that they, after Lindbergh was done flying the aircraft around by 1928, I think it was, he flew it back to Washington. And after this whole goodwill tour around South and Central America, he flew it back to Washington, D.C., and they just hung it up inside the museum or whatever they did back in those days. I don't know if 1928 is the same. It was hanging up, but it's been there ever since. I've got some quotes for you today from Lindbergh. And here's one. I live only in the moment, in this strange, unmortal space, crowded with beauty, pierced with danger. He was a pretty good writer, Lindbergh. He wrote a number of books. I got one of them here that I picked up. I don't know, I think it was at the Pequot Library or something, for like $1. And it was The Spirit of St. Louis, right? And then there was another one I had that I picked up. It was so old, though, it started falling apart, and I got rid of it. And it was called We. That's it, W-E. And that was like his first book. And the story was that there was him and the aircraft, okay, which he later said that the publisher, mistook that to mean him and the aircraft, that it was really him plus the backers from St. Louis. So I'll leave it to other historians or people to figure out which we is we. At least one of the we in both cases was Lindbergh. So he does it. I mean, this is like an amazing thing. It's not the first time the Atlantic's been crossed, but it was the first time the Atlantic was crossed by one person. And he flew like 2,000 miles further than anybody else. And it was the first trip that actually went from a major city to a major city. Lindbergh does it to Paris in 33.5 hours. Flies 1,000 miles through snow and sleet, cheering French carry him off the field, which is true. People did souvenir hunting. They took hunks of the fabric of the Spirit of St. Louis and as souvenirs. His flight log went missing. People kind of ransacked the aircraft. Treasure hunters, souvenir pirates. That's what we call them at the Intrepid. Okay, Sunday, May 22nd, 1927. And so this guy goes from being an airmail pilot to being the most famous person in the entire world. And that's one of the things, I mean, psychologically, I'm in the field of behavioral health. So these things are always interesting. What effect does that have on a person to go from like basically just somebody that nobody knows in an obscure part of the country, and then bam, this guy is a worldwide sensation in every sense of the world. See? Lindbergh's Paris trip, in case you didn't believe me, makes him a world hero. People couldn't get enough of him. Right? He gets a big ticker tape parade down the Canyon of Heroes in New York City. He starts getting medals. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross, which was quasi-legal because to win the Distinguished Flying Cross, you have to do something that had to do with flying in the service. And he wasn't doing this as part of the United States Air Corps, you see? So it's a little bit quasi with that. And then he won the Medal of Honor too. Well, not, you don't win the Medal of Honor, you receive the Medal of Honor. But that was another one that was kind of controversial. But who am I to judge? And then, of course, Time magazine, 1927. And this was the Neil Armstrong of his day, even more so. By 1969, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and the whole Apollo thing, I mean, we had already been, you and I had already been completely acculturated to technology, doing all sorts of things, and things all seemed possible. But back here in 1927, the world was a more I don't want to say primitive place, but it was a simpler place. And this was amazing. 1927, Time Magazine, Man of the Year. And the youngest Man of the Year ever, still to this day, who was, on Time Magazine. Looks good in a uniform. So I always say, if you don't look good, if a guy doesn't look good in a uniform or a tuxedo, forget it. You're done. Right, here's a medal that was struck for him and presented by the much maligned President Hoover, August 15th, 1930. The Medal of Congress, the Lindbergh Medal. So after the Spirit of St. Louis fame, or during the Spirit of St. Louis fame, Lindbergh, there's a lot of open doors for Lindbergh. He's flying around and he's taking his aircraft on a goodwill tour of South and Central America. And the daughter of the ambassador to several of the Triangle countries in Central America is one Anne Morrow, pictured here to the right. These two are married soon thereafter. And Anne Morrow is a very, very good, from the standpoint of compatibility, I guess, a wife to Charles Lindbergh. And they then fly around the world. They fly all over the place together. And then Anne Morrow kind of becomes a cause célèbre herself. Because, I mean, it's a big deal now. It's one thing for a guy to be flying around, but with the kind of social stereotypes that we had during the day, I mean, it was a big deal that you had a woman who was right there alongside Charles Lindbergh, who was arguably the most bravest person ever. And she was an excellent navigator. You know, Charles Lindbergh was good with dead reckoning, if you know what I'm talking about, but he didn't do any celestial navigation. The whole trip over to Europe, he did dead reckoning. And he was lucky that he didn't have major winds that drove him off course or something, because that would have been a problem. And but Anne Morrow flew all over the place with Charles Lindbergh, and the two of them were like, talk about a celebrity couple. These two were a celebrity couple. She certainly looks the part, doesn't she? And there's our handsome young aviator, right? With the open cockpit looking over. And the next photograph here, you see, that's Amelia Earhart, right? There's Amelia Earhart. So you can see what we got going on here. I'm not saying that she ripped it off or anything, but, you know, I mean, she kind of rode a little bit unconscious coattails of Charles Lindbergh. But I don't want to take anything away from Amelia Earhart. She was, you know, famous and deserving in her own right. The Lindbergh baby. Now, this, of course, became, I guess this is probably the first case of the paparazzi driving people crazy, right? The Lindbergh baby, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. This poor kid, right? 20 months old, gets essentially abducted from the second floor of the Lindbergh's house, which is near Hopewell, New Jersey. I don't know if you know where that is. When I was a kid, my brother, who was 5 years older than me, had an airplane, and we flew all over the place. You know, as a 14-year-old, I was literally flying this airplane, and it was kind of neat from the standpoint of a kid. And one of the airports we flew out of, if that's what you want to call it, was really a grassy field, was an airport in Hopewell. And And so March 1932, there's the second floor. There's the actual ladder that was left by the perpetrator, who remained a mystery for like 2.5 years. And you know what they did? The FBI, they actually analyzed the wood and the workmanship on this ladder because it was a homemade ladder. And that was part of the evidence. And also they had ransom money where all of the serial numbers were all traceable. And so they caught up with this guy who was a carpenter who had been caught after tracing the serial numbers buying gas for his car in the Bronx. Here's a poster. Wanted information as the whereabouts of Charles Lindbergh Jr., blah, blah. And this was like the biggest story. And it became it was one of these things that is so harped upon. It became, from my standpoint, all these years later, kind of like another embarrassment that people are so voyeuristically crazy about it. But that's just, another story of human nature, I guess. So anyway, before they found the alleged murderer, because the baby was dead. They found the baby soon thereafter, even after the ransom money was delivered. They found the baby buried not far off. They figured that what happened was the perpetrator had not meant to kill the kid, but probably dropped the child, causing some kind of spinal injury. I'm not sure, but the baby was dead. In the meantime, Charles Lindbergh is an aviation sought after by everybody, Pan American Airways, you name it. And here is one Igor Sikorsky consulting with Charles Lindbergh, because Lindbergh was the one for Pan American Airways. What was that guy's name? Juan Trippe, right? The head of Pan Am. And Pan Am had the China Clippers, these big flying boats, and many of the flying boats that Pan Am used were Sikorsky flying boats. So Sikorsky worked with Charles Lindbergh for the specifications that were desirable for Pan Am. And there's a good photograph of the two of them. I got a nice presentation on Sikorsky too, by the way, if you guys are interested sometime. Right, this is right here on the Housatonic. And there's Charles Lindbergh, and there's the crowd, and this is, while he's hanging around at Sikorsky. So they finally catch up with this guy, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, and he was buying gas in the Bronx with the money. And that's how they caught up with him. And then they used the forensic, and it turns out the guy's a carpenter, right? And so, they traced the wood and the tools and all the rest of that. And I don't know if this was, he probably did it, but I don't know. I didn't study this case specifically to know if they had the wrong man or not, but he was probably the right man from what I've read. And he was convicted in this big trial and electrocuted, put to death in New Jersey. Excuse me. So what happens now is that the Lindberghs can't go anywhere. They can't go anywhere without the press mobbing them. And Lindbergh was concerned about his other children. He had another 3-year-old son by this time. The Lindberghs had several children. And so they're so tired of being mobbed by the press everywhere they went that they literally they absconded away. They left. They got fake names and they slipped away on a steamer to England. here's the first place they stayed. This is in Kent, called Long Barn. They rented this place in England, and then later on they actually had another place. And so they were in exile in Europe because they were tired. They wanted to go someplace where they weren't going to be hounded every moment. So the Lindberghs were in Europe in the 1930s, initially because of this. So between 1936 and 1938, Lindbergh makes several trips to Germany, right? And he's a celebrity in Germany in the upcoming, by this time, 1936 to 1938 is the heyday of when one Hermann Göring, the person on the right here, is building up the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, right? And there, of course, is a big photograph of Herr Adolf on the desk. So what happens here is that Lindbergh is kind of celebrated by the Germans, and the Germans, he's a VIP, and the Germans are letting him fly their new aircraft, the 109s, and etc. And remember, he's still part of an Air Corps in New York. I mean, in the United States, I should say. And he is a valuable piece of information. He comes back to the United States in 1939, and he gives the United States Air Force the most valuable information that they have of the capabilities of the Nazi Air Force. About the flight characteristics and the way that they fly them. It seems it also turns out that Lindbergh has become quite enamored with the Nazis. Right, so it creates this, I don't know, today I guess we would call it a problem of optics, where he is America's sweetheart apple pie hero, yet at the same time he seems to have this thing for the Nazis, right? And he's advocating against any intervention in Europe, no matter what the Germans do, or no matter what the Germans take, in the form of taking Czechoslovakia and annexing Austria and all the rest of that stuff. He's literally an apologist for Hitler. And, and this becomes like one of these things that don't fit together, okay? Now, there were many people in the United States who felt as though we shouldn't become involved in the war in World War II. And remember, World War I was already in recent memory. It was only 20 years before. And it was kind of like, what are we going to go over there for again and lose another generation of men? The Allies haven't still paid us their war debts from World War I. The Europeans are going to be fighting forever. It's American not to get involved, because George Washington said in his farewell address, don't get entangled in these foreign things, right? So there were a lot of people who actually resonated with Lindbergh's point of view. This is some kind of a, I don't know, Nazi medal that is being presented to Lindbergh by one Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. And these are all interesting characters by themselves. Every one of the high command in the Nazi party is somebody. I would love to do a history series, just talking about each one of these people up there on top of the Nazi party, right? And Göring himself, in less corpulent days, was an ace, a fighter ace for the Germany in World War I. He wore the famous, what did they call that thing? The Pour le Mérite, I think it was, the blue max. And but here he is, and this is one of these things now here, even in 1938, this is considered controversial because people were criticizing him and saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have taken this stuff that the Germans were giving you, because it kind of makes it seem as though you're like in sync with the Germans. Maybe you should give the thing back. I think it's a sword or something like that with a swastika on top. I don't know. and it doesn't matter. But and so you have this kind of optic now. This would be the same thing now as is kind of like you find out that the person who gave you a campaign contribution was like guilty of, I don't know, pedophilia or something. You want to give the money back as soon as you can to show that you don't support anything that they did. Well, Lindbergh refused to give all of the accolades from the Nazis back. He didn't want to denounce them. As a matter of fact, like I said, he was an apologist for them. And he refused to give any of these things back that they gave him, saying, well, what's that going to do? And so it started chewing at his perception as the American boy next door who was everyone's darling. Now, he's got some things to say, Lindbergh. Right, we can have peace and security only so long as we band together to preserve that most priceless possession, our inheritance of European blood, only so long as we guard ourselves against attack by foreign armies and dilution by foreign races. So that's not somebody who is putting a spin on something he said. That is Charles Lindbergh. You know, so the thing is that in America, I mean, it was easy to look at the Nazis and say, well, you know, these people aren't right, okay? But there were plenty of people in the United States in the 1930s who believed in two things: A, anti-Semitism, and B, eugenics, from the standpoint of races mixing or not mixing. And we should keep this pure and we should keep that pure. And maybe these people shouldn't be able to reproduce if they're mentally ill or that sort of thing. And that was the hot thing back in those days. And the United States was just as involved in this as the Germans were. The Germans more famously took it to a homicidal end in the form of genocide, etc. But these feelings were actually quite predominant in the United States. And he's consulting with somebody else he became friends with, Henry Ford, right? And, you know, and the two of them have a lot in common from even like a mechanical standpoint or the understanding of aircraft. Don't forget that Henry Ford had built the largest plant in the world, the Willow Run plant for production of bombers in Germany, in B-24 Liberators, the Willow Run plant. You see, so these two have plenty much to talk about, okay? But what they seem to talk about the most was the Jews. And here's another shot in 1940, and he's there consulting with one Igor Sikorsky again, right here in Connecticut. And so that's 1940, and there's Igor showing him, you know, one of his new, geez, I forgot what they called them before they were helicopters, roto gyros or something. I'm sure one of you out there knows that. And also the Army was still very enamored, and he's still part of the Air Corps. He's promoted to like colonel by now. And he is doing all kinds of flight testing and conferring with the Army Air Corps on all of our aircraft. I wonder if you notice what kind of plane that is for you World War II Army Air Corps buffs. It's a P-38 Lightning. That's the starboard engine. Very valuable guy. Recognizable, professional, knowledgeable, flown all kinds of different aircraft. He flew the Nazi aircraft. You want to keep him around, wouldn't you? But what happens is that he becomes more and more vocal about the United States being wrong to enter the war, you see, and why we should stay out of it. And there's a lot of people who are involved in the America First Committee, and including this other character named oh man, what was his name? Father Coughlin. I don't know, excuse me for the pronunciation. You know who I'm talking about. And Henry Ford. Okay, here's my favorite quote. Here we go. Let me just move a couple of things. The Jews are one of the principal forces attempting to lead the United States into the war. The Jews' greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. I am saying that the leaders of the Jewish race wish to involve us in the war for reasons that are not American. This is Charles Lindbergh out of his own words, own mouth, September 11th, 1941. So what happens now is that Roosevelt is getting pissed off at him, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt denounces him. Roosevelt has some strong words for Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh felt like he had no choice since FDR had questioned in his opinion, his loyalty to America. Lindbergh resigns from the Army Air Corps. Which was just fine for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by the way. Now, I get a series of interesting slides for you here. I remember Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, I don't know if you know this, he did a lot of artwork during World War II and before World War II. And Lindbergh actually, for a while there, was one of his favorite targets as a part of the America First Committee, right? So here's Dr. Seuss, and I hope you can see that where you are. Right, and here's Lindbergh flying. You see the Lindbergh on the side of the aircraft, and he's flying a banner. It says, "It's smart to shop at Adolph's. All victories guaranteed." Right, and you can see the biting sarcasm of all of this. Here's another one, and this is probably Lindbergh was so had been receiving all of these medals that were being struck, and he had the Medal of Honor, and he had the Distinguished Flying Cross, and you had that other gold thing I showed you before, were from Congress, right? So this is Dr. Seuss's satire on, here's another medal for you that we should strike for Charles Lindbergh, right? The Lindbergh Quarter, with Charles Lindbergh like an ostrich sticking his head in the sand. Right, about the coming war that we're going to have to fight. You see, in God we trust, and how, right? And part of the cartoon is, since when did we swap our ego for an ostrich? Here's another one. So there's Lindbergh on the left here, you see, and what he's doing is he's appeasing the Nazi dragon. Right? 'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear. You see? So, he's just, this is kind of, you see other cartoons like this that Dr. Seuss did about Neville Chamberlain and about what fools the appeasers were to Hitler, that they're just using you as, I guess the right term would be useful idiots. One more for you, right? Science marches on, right? Here's Lindbergh holding some kind of a creature in this bowl. Fellow experimenters, we are gathered here today to mate the eagle and the jellyfish, right? And it's, it's a cutting sarcasm about Lindbergh. Oh, one more, I'm sorry. And there's Lindbergh, who is peddling the Nazi garbage. Right? In other words, he's covering for Hitler and he's making excuses. So he's doing the bidding of Joseph Goebbels and Hitler by shoveling this garbage around. You see it? The Nazi anti-Semite stink wagon. So this all ends. The America First Committee ends right after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th, 1941. Germany declares war on America, the United States, on December 11th, 1941. And this whole thing about America first and we should stay out of the war becomes immediately a moot point, immediately. And not only that, but Charles Lindbergh essentially has been shown up and he just drops the whole thing. And he now wants to get back, he wants to get into the war. And what happens is that Roosevelt refuses from the top, refuses him to be granted back his commission as a colonel. Right, so that was Roosevelt. And so what happens is that Lindbergh starts working as a consultant for different airplane companies. And since the airplanes were flying all over the world, in this notable part in the Pacific, this is in an island off New Guinea, and he's standing there with a bunch of other guys who were probably pilots, I suppose, Marine Corps pilots, and they're flying the F-4U Corsair, right, that gull-winged aircraft. Many of them were manufactured right over here out in Stratford. Anyway, he is not a military person, he's a consultant, but he wanted to do his part. He did all of these crazy things, and he's showing the pilots how best to get the performance out of the F-4U. And it turns out that unofficially, he flies 50 combat missions. And he actually shoots down a Japanese aircraft. You see, but it's all unofficial because he's really just a consultant, because Roosevelt made sure that he would never have another commission back in the service. There's his grave. His later years were marked with a lot of, he became, once again, a consultant after the war, and then he became an environmentalist. And he flew around and to different places with environmental causes and all kinds of other causes. His celebrity helped him gain immediate notoriety and so many things, right? And by this time, he's estranged from his wife. And it turns out that he had fathered children with 3 other women over in Europe. And he vowed to them that not to keep the secret of who he was and who the children's father was until after his death, which they did. Born Michigan 1902, died in Maui 1974. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. I love stamps. Here's some great stamps about Charles Lindbergh, right? Isn't that a good one? Airmail stamp, I guess. Lindbergh flies the Atlantic, right? 32 cents. That must have been 1998. So the guy is, he is still Mr. Apple Pie American hero. Another quote from him, and let me just move a couple of things around. Life is like a landscape. You live in the midst of it, but can describe it only from the vantage point of distance. He's a smart guy, and a very eloquent writer too. When I watch species other than my own, their instincts' wisdom is what most impresses and disturbs me. Here's a stamp issued by Gibraltar, which I didn't know issued their own stamps, but Charles Lindbergh in Spirit of St. Louis, blah, 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 commemorating him. I grew up as a disciple of science. I know its fascination. I have felt the godlike power man derives from his machines. Grenada, or Grenada, I don't know the difference. The Maldives, issuing a postage stamp on the 50th anniversary of Lindbergh's Atlantic crossing. Nicaragua, Remember, he made that whole Good World Tour after his flight. The National Postal Museum, United States. What kind of man would live where there is no daring? I don't believe in taking foolish chances, but nothing can be accomplished without taking any chance at all. So there's the actual aircraft in the Smithsonian. I just love this stuff, right? And there it is. You know, and it's got the stickers from all of the different countries that were visited in this aircraft by Charles Lindbergh. You can see how the fairing goes right around. Lindbergh wanted the airplane to have as clean a line as possible. And, you know, without having a windshield, that helped also. It helped with the aerodynamics and maximized the size of the tanks that you were able to have there, right? Great stuff. So this is my last photograph for you. And with all of that, this is how, in my mind, you know, despite all of that other stuff from the America First Committee and the Nazi stuff, this is, in my mind, how I remember Charles Lindbergh, a young, handsome guy who really had, you know, you had to imagine that took a tremendous amount of endurance and nerve to fly across the Atlantic. They had that movie with Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart, I mean, you know, I respect the guy because he was an Air Force pilot himself, very accomplished flyer. But Jimmy Stewart took a lot of heat with that movie, not because he's not a good actor or the story was bad. It's just that when Jimmy Stewart did it, he was over twice the age of Charles Lindbergh when he flew across the Atlantic. So the criticism was like, you can't make yourself look young enough to make this work. Anyway, gentlemen, that is my slideshow for you. Okay, I'm going to go out of screen share. And I hope you enjoyed that. In the time allotted, I wanted to give you enough, but not too much.
Thank you very much, Art.
You're welcome.
That was terrific. Anyone have any questions, please raise your hand from the participant screen.
Yeah.
And Larry Holtzman is first.
I'll just say, hold on. I'm just taking a sip out of my alcoholic beverage disguised as a glass of tea. Okay.
Drink up.
What do you got?
Larry.
Larry?
Larry, you're muted.
Enjoy your beverage, and thanks for a great presentation. A couple of questions about Lindbergh as a flyer. One, he was a colonel by the age of 25. How did he accomplish that?
By being famous. Nobody else would have done that. He was awarded, he kept getting awarded. Okay, he was actually, I think he became a captain later on. I mean, a colonel later on, but he was a captain by the time he was 25. All right, I know that
because the headlines all called him colonel when he made the flight.
Oh, he wasn't a colonel when he made the flight.
But you're
I mean, I'm pretty sure. Okay, that's something that we should double check, but I'm pretty sure that's not correct.
That was in the news. That was in the newspaper stories.
On your slide.
Well, if it was in the newspaper, it must be accurate. Right?
Oh,
So, I mean, see, there's nothing to discuss. I'm obviously wrong. So,
and how did the Parisians know that he was landing? I mean, for a crowd of 100,000 to be there when he landed, was there radio transmissions?
yeah. Well, he didn't have a
or
radio.
even no?
He didn't have a radio. He didn't want to take the extra weight with him, but they knew when he was supposed to show up. And then he was flying over other places to get to Paris. And, you know, so word got around quite rapidly that he was on his way. You know, and he came down very low on a number of cases. And there was one case where he actually flying around and he actually banked his wings. He was asking some people who were in a boat like, which way Paris was, and I understand. I mean, it wasn't like they had people got on Twitter and said, hey, everybody run to the airport, but they knew he was coming. This was a worldwide event. Even these people who got killed trying to fly across the Atlantic were already heroes. And it was a really big deal. It was such a big deal that it was like a major worldwide event, and this was still an age of pomp, and it was before World War II, and France and the United States were part of the same side and in this great war, World War I, and they were victorious together. And so people love a story like this, and the people in France they treated like Lindbergh like he couldn't believe it, like he was just a regular guy, really. And I think that for me as a behavioral health expert, I mean, I think of you think about what would have happened to Elvis Presley if he didn't become so damned celebrity. You know what I mean? Would he have been swamped? Would he have been a drug addict? Would have this have happened? That event? Would he had to make all the stupid movies? And what happens to a person when they receive like this overwhelming acclaim? And really, that's what happened to Lindbergh. And it started, of course, when he landed in Paris. It was just unbelievable. They carried him off. They carried him off on their shoulders. The French had him the next day. He was there with, the head of France with an American flag and the French flag. The French didn't show anybody's flag except the French flag ever. But they had the American flag for Lindbergh. It was unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. He flew around on some goodwill flights in Europe. Then they took the plane apart and then they brought it back to the United States. Lindbergh came back to the US on the ill-fated cruiser. I think it was not the Nashville, the Memphis. And then the ticker tape parade. And then he went they put the Spirit of St. Louis back together. He flew it around South America. That's when he met his wife.
Okay. Next question, Bob Rosenthal.
Yeah, this is more a comment than a question. My grandmother was there in Paris, one of the crowd cheering when Lindbergh landed.
Now there's a story.
She was a huge fan of Lindbergh. And then, of course, 10 years later, when it became clear he was an anti-Semite, she was totally disheartened. And she told us that story more than once.
This thing with Lindbergh being an anti-Semite is like, he wouldn't have considered himself an anti-Semite, right? Which is kind of like, it's kind of like, if you have an accent, it's not that has the accent. Only other people have accents, right? Only other people have accents. You never have the accent. And, so Lindbergh, he was very rational about this, like many people were during the day. It's important to see, just in a general sense here, especially in the United States, because we see ourselves in contrast with Nazi Germany. Okay, this was fairly close, the 1930s, the 1920s, to this, Darwin's work, right? The theories that Darwin had about the origin of species and the survival of the fittest. So the eugenics were very, very, very fresh. And that was as hot a thing back then, like environmentalism now. I mean, this is science, this is it. This is what we believe in. So it was natural to think in the form of eugenics, which is this racism comes out of, was that, you got these people walking around with calipers in these white lab coats. And they have calipers and they're measuring the foreheads of a woman and noticing that the forehead of a man is slightly larger. So that proves without a shadow of a doubt that men have more prefrontal brain capacity than women. And that's why women shouldn't be driving a damn car. You see what I mean? So that's the way that got used. Now, as far as the Jews were concerned, the Jews were considered a different race. The Jews weren't considered white people that just happened to be Jewish, right? And that's where you get this thing of different races. And so if the Jews are a different race, it means that biologically they're different than other white people. You see? And that got heavily exploited and brought to its worst end in Nazi Germany, right? So, you know, for somebody like a Hitler and probably somebody like a Lindbergh, it wouldn't matter. I mean, let's say, for instance, you were a Jewish person, but your great-grandfather became a Lutheran, right? So you walked around and you were raised as a Lutheran. But if you did this genetic background thing and you found out that you were, I don't know, a 16th Jewish someplace, to somebody like Lindbergh or the Nazis, you were Jewish. Because Jewish wasn't a choice. Jewish was hereditary. You see? So if Jews are evil and they're hereditarily evil, then it doesn't matter how long your family's been a Lutheran, you're still evil. You see? And you know, so it's hard to say how far Lindbergh took that. But back in those days, I'm not defending Lindbergh, I'm putting it in context. I mean, that was, if you walked around and you say, well, the Jews have all the money. I mean, shit, gentlemen, I'm 63 years old and I grew up with people saying that to me. Right? You know, so that's a different story. But Lindbergh was part and parcel to the way a lot of people kind of felt. And the Nazis also in the United States, there was another, this is not Lindbergh specifically, but another thing that people apologized to Nazis for here in the US was that Hitler hated the communists, and therefore maybe we should let Hitler, I don't know, maybe we should leave him there in Germany, because as horrible as he is, it's still better having him as a bulwark against communism. So maybe Hitler hates Stalin so badly, or the Soviet Union so badly, that we'll let Hitler act as that barrier to communism, you see? So you had now, that was also a very, very large thing in the 1920s and the 1930s, because the first Red Scare, of course, was, you know, at the end of World War I with the Bolshevik takeover of Russia, you see, and the Communist Manifesto under Marx and Engels and then Lenin, of course. Communism was never a localized thing. It wasn't a nationalist thing for communism. Communism was a worldwide phenomenon whose end was to create global socialism. And it was supposed to have, according to Karl Marx, it wasn't supposed to happen in an agrarian, rural, poor place like Russia. That was a fluke. It was supposed to happen in an industrialized first world country like Germany, which fit the bill for the United States in the 1920s. You see, so people were expecting the socialist foot to drop here in the United States. There's another reason why people gave Hitler more slack, you see. It doesn't really, it overlaps into the Lindbergh thing, but the Lindbergh thing seemed to be more of, we shouldn't be fighting this war, and the Western capitalists are the ones who were trying to drive it, and the Jews, okay? Because the nefarious purpose of a Jew wanting to create a war is because they can make more profit no matter who else gets killed. You see what I mean? Which fits the bill if you think that Jews are that way.
Jerry Krantz.
Yeah, hey, I don't know if you noticed on your first picture of the New York Times, he did it. that was when he just made it, that there was an article in the lower left-hand corner about somebody named Levine. Now, that person was Charlie Levine. Charlie Levine was the first passenger on a transatlantic flight. He got his notoriety from that. He's also a cousin of my wife, Joan, maybe a second or third or fourth cousin. And he was so famous that they actually have a song in Yiddish about Charlie Levine. And it goes, Levine, 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 Levine in the flying machine. And I can get that to you. You might want to, I understand he was quite a scoundrel, but you might want to have a lecture on Charlie Levine one of these days.
It reminds me, I worked for a guy once, a Jewish guy, and he actually was in the military. He was in the Army, you know, part of something. I don't remember the name of the brand of the particular outfit, but it was like the Army Air Force, and they flew, right? And they did parachuting, et cetera. So I asked him, I said, well, then you must have actually been part of this parachute thing. And he says, no, I never did that. And I said to him, I says, what do you mean you never did that? How did you get away with that? He says, and you know what he said to me? I'll never forget it. He says, Jews don't jump out of airplanes. That's what he said to me. Jews don't jump out of airplanes. As a matter of fact as that. It was just funny as hell. And anyway.
Okay, Art, I have two technical questions. How many gallons of fuel was he carrying?
Oh, I don't know. I got to go back. I had that written down someplace. I'm not sure. I don't have that information. It was an awful lot.
Second,
You know, and he literally, he didn't want to have a radio. He didn't want to have a direction finder. He didn't want to have a lot of stuff with him. He didn't want to have anything, because he wanted every spare ounce dedicated to that extra fuel reserve. Okay.
When you say dead reckoning, what does that actually mean?
Dead reckoning means that you're not using celestial navigation, right? Like with a sextant. Dead reckoning means that you have, let's use a different example. If he was flying over the ocean, right? Which, and I don't know if you've ever been out in the ocean, but it is a different kind of thing when you get up on deck and you're looking 360 degrees and all you see is horizon. Okay, there's no point of reference, you see? But if I was flying from here to, I don't know, up the coast or something like that, I would have on my chart where every smokestack was, every lighthouse was, you see? And I would know the exact geographical distance between them and their location, you see? So as long as I could see them, I could actually plot a course between them and know what direction I'm going in, and knowing what the airspeed is and calculating for other factors like a headwind or a side drift or something like that. I can actually calculate how long it's going to take me from point A to point B at a certain amount of speed, right? At a certain altitude under certain conditions. So that means that after 45 minutes of flying at this specific course, that I should now, what should come into view are the smokestacks of the power plant in Bridgeport. You see what I mean? Yeah. And then, so that is dead reckoning from point to point to point to point. Right. You see?
Would he use a compass?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You got to have a compass.
Okay.
You got to have a compass.
All right. Before Lloyd.
Didn't hear.
Lloyd, contract.
Myself. Okay. I'd like to say that in the 30s, there was a very large German group, the Bundesstaat, I think they called themselves, in Connecticut, for instance. And there were German camps. And so there was a very large contingent of Americans who believed in the German program, the Nazi program.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it reminds me of something else I forgot to mention. You know, in his later years, right after the war, the Lindberghs lived right here in Darien, Connecticut. Right? Did you know that? They live
No.
right in Darien, Connecticut,
Mm.
you know, which reminds me of a movie called Gentleman's Agreement, if you've ever seen that one.
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
Also, I wanted to say that the communists, because I had an uncle who was a card-carrying communist. I found that out when I went for security clearance. I couldn't get it. But
Why? Because your uncle was a communist?
yeah, because my uncle was a card-carrying communist in the 30s.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, you know, maybe it's because we were in a deep depression where everything was kind of like falling apart. And the Nazi regime was showing that people were prospering. Stalin Russia was prospering, of course, at the expense of the Ukrainians. But that's all I wanted to mention. And I enjoyed the Lindbergh presentation. There are a lot of things I never knew about him.
Yeah, no, we could go for hours. I could talk about it. I tried to get that in on time for you, but excellent discussion, gentlemen.
Two more questions. One, Joe Andriano.
Yeah, what was Lindbergh's nationality? Was he German, Scandinavian?
He was Scandinavian.
Okay. And the last question, Larry Holzman.
In the slide pictures of Goering presenting Lindbergh awards, Goering was not wearing a Luftwaffe uniform, whereas there were other people in these pictures who were. How come Goering was wearing civilian clothes?
Because Goering can do whatever he wants.
Oh.
I mean, no, it sounds like I'm being sarcastic, but Goering was this. Goering used his uniform the way Mussolini used his uniform. Okay, he had 10 uniforms. They were all custom made, and you know, so he wore the uniform more as a prop than needing to wear the uniform. Okay, Goring could do whatever he wanted. Goring got to decide everything. He was the most powerful person in the Reich. Okay, literally. And if Goring wanted to, if there was somebody important that happened to have that bit of Jewish blood in them, but Goring felt that they were necessary or he liked them, then it was okay. Goring could do whatever he wanted. Okay, and it wasn't until much later on, it would be a big slap in the face to Goring when Hitler wrote his last succession of who was going to be leader of the Reich. Goring was flabbergasted that it wasn't going to be him, you know, and instead it was Admiral Karl Donitz. Okay, Goring was this egoistic, effeminate, drug-addicted person. And back in the day, he was a brave man in World War I, but it all caught up with him in his celebrity with the Nazis. You know.
Okay. Art, thank you very, very much for terrific presentations, great answers to the questions. And again, it was a pleasure hearing you. I think we all learned a lot about Charles Lindbergh. I know I did. And again, thank you very much. Back to you, Joe.
Again, thank you, Art, for your presentation. Hopefully we can get a few more in. I know in the past you've had some great presentations also.
Thank you. If you're interested, I send out a newsletter once every other month now talking about the other programs that I'm doing around the area. If you're interested in knowing what those are, in case you want to get on board, case in point, I'm doing a series of presentations at the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. And it was on World War II history. I'm doing one on Vietnam now. I'm going to be doing one on the Revolutionary War. So if you want to be on my newsletter list, just send me an email and I'll be glad to add you to it. It's agott@optonline.net. agott@optonline.net. Okay.
Thank you, Art. Okay. Gentlemen, as always, be safe, stay well, be careful, and God willing, we'll see everybody next Thursday. Enjoy the week.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.